Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Ann Riley Moffat. I'm a senior editor on the energy and commodities team at Bloomberg News in New York. I can't believe I'm following Jordan Holman. That will be a tough act to follow, but thank you for joining us here today. We're going to be talking about feeding tomorrow's growing population and some of the ways that high-tech food innovation can play a role. So I'm joined today by three experts in the field, Rachel Vizman, co-founder and CEO of SavorEat, Jim Mellon, co-founder and executive director of Agronomics, and Will Patrick, CEO and co-founder of Culture Biosciences. I know there's a lot we want to get to today. We only have 20 minutes. So let's just start off quickly. We're talking today about plant-based or alternative proteins. Some people say vegan. I know that's sometimes a loaded word. So quickly, what language do you use to describe what it is that your company is doing or investing in? And so far, how are consumers or investors responding to it? Let's go down the line. We'll start with you, Jim.
Well, thanks very much, Ann Riley. So basically, plant-based stuff is well known to consumers beyond impossible in the United States. Here in the UK, corn and meatless farms as an example. It's not the area that we focus on. We're the world's largest investors in what's called cultured food or cultured materials, which is essentially food and materials grown in labs, and also in precision fermentation, which is typically used to create replicas of dairy products. That's the next wave after the plant-based stuff, and that's the stuff that we're concentrating on at the moment.
Great. I will be asking you more about that, but first to Will, talk to us about what you do and what language you use for it.
Honestly, it's pretty similar, and one overarching term that people use in the field is cellular agriculture. Using cells to produce food, and a couple other terms that are important are. You might call this all biomanufacturing, which is the use of bioreactors to grow the cells in order to produce whether it's a food protein or the actual meat cells themselves.
Okay, and Rachel?
Great. So what SavorEat is doing is basically can do all. So we are starting with plant-based, but we are calling it a meat alternative since we couldn't care less what will be the source of the protein or the source of the fat. It can come from culture, it can come from fermentation, it can also come from plant-based. We are starting with plant-based due to regulatory issues and due to the fact that most of the population been educated to consume plant-based. But the beauty of SavorEat product that this is a platform that we can also integrate culture meat in the future.
Great. Now some of those words maybe would scare your average consumer, or at least they might not know, necessarily what they are. Is that the biggest obstacle to lab-grown meat or cultured meat or digitally manufactured meat or fish or protein going mainstream? Is it cultural acceptance? Is it price? Is it scale? Rachel, tell me more about that.
For us, as working in the plant-based, starting in the plant-based, as that the market and the population is quite familiar with the plant-based and plant-based product. I think that it's still something that needs to be educated when we're talking about cultured meat and we're talking about fermentation. There is still a work to do there in that area and in that aspect. And I think that the consumer are much more conscious about what they are eating, and they would like to know more, and they are very curious about those developments. And I think those discussions and those interests increased dramatically in the recent years, and I believe that it will continue to grow as we see it today in the market.
Okay. And Will, making the assumption that we are trying to displace animal farm production here around the world, how do we do that, and how do we do it quickly enough to really make a dent?
So I think, the thing that's going to happen first is we're going to get much better versions of things like the Impossible Burger. You've seen these plant-based alternatives really take a dent out of market share, but they're, even with prices coming down on plant-based meats, we're not seeing, large adoption compared to traditional meat. So what I think is going to happen first is, like the Impossible Burger, there's going to be new ingredients that are put into plant-based meats that make them better and better simulations of the real thing. you think about the Impossible Burger, it has a heme protein, which is produced through fermentation. Heme, like hemoglobin, it's what makes the Impossible Burger bloody, and it gives the umami flavor. We're going to see a lot more of these types of ingredients. Think about things like animal oils, even other proteins like collagen, elastin, fibronectin, which create a lot of the structure of meat. These are going to be produced individually using fermentation and then mixed into plant-based alternatives. It's going to make the plant-based burgers much more yummy, tastier, better textures, similar to the real thing. And I think that's where we're going to see a lot more adoption, is when those plant-based options become much more similar to actual meat.
Similar in taste, or also similar in price? What does it take to get down to a level that your average household can afford this stuff?
So, if you think of, like I said earlier, actually the prices of plant-based meats have come down a lot. But interestingly, adoption has increased a little bit with the lower prices, but not that much. So to me, that means that we can't just bring down the prices alone from like something like a Beyond Burger or an Impossible Burger in order to have a big impact. We have to make those products much better and tastier for consumers. So I think actually most of the impact is going to come from real innovation, making plant-based burgers much more like the real thing, much more desirable from consumers. That's what's going to really move the needle versus just price declines.
Okay, thank you. I'd love to ask about some of the ESG implications of this space. And Jim, maybe I can turn this one to you. A lot of these companies could, in theory, displace traditional agriculture, which of course is a huge emitter of greenhouse gases. But have these startups proven they can really create fewer greenhouse gases, or use less water, or do the things that really investors and people are looking for?
Yeah, that's a good question. Well, 31% of greenhouse gases, and particularly the bad ones, come from intensive farming and deforestation. Deforestation is directly linked to agriculture because they're basically chopping down the forest to grow things like soybeans to put into animals. And it's important to note that 70% of all crops grown on this planet go into animals, which are extremely inefficient factories. The way I look at this is, I'll give you a cow as an example, is a cow requires 25 times more inputs than it puts out in the form of protein. Chicken is about 9 to 1. Cell ag, when it's at scale, will be about 2.5 to 1. So the capacity for actually having lower prices on much healthier for the environment and for human health products is absolutely there. So basically 1% of 1% of land use, 7% of water use, less than half of energy use. That's what the cell ag at scale will require, which will obviously have an incredibly beneficial effect. But I also want to make one final point on the ESG. A lot of people don't realize that 80% of antibiotics go into farmed animals, particularly in China and in India, because of the close proximity of things like pigs and ducks and chickens. That antibiotic use means that we're becoming increasingly resistant to the antibiotics that have saved so many lives over the last 50 years or so. And we could become totally resistant in due course, which would create a much worse pandemic risk than the one we're going through at the moment, if that can be believed, and God help us. So we need to reduce the amount of antibiotics in use. And one of the ways to do that is to reduce the level of animal production. The cell ag stuff is here and now. All the companies have products and you can taste them. It's just a question of scale.
Okay, thank you. I don't think a lot of people are talking about that pandemic risk, so I'm glad you brought that up. When we talk about scale, of course, funding is a big piece of that. Who should be funding this digital food manufacturing revolution? Rachel, maybe I'll start with you. Should this funding be coming from governments or green investors, or, current emitters like the beef industry? Should they be behind this?
I would say that everyone should be part of it. I think that the movement of getting into the meat alternative segment is growing. We also saw that even in SavorEat, we got the support from the government, that the Israeli government, the Israeli Innovation Center, greatly support the company for the last 2 years. And definitely the meat manufacturer got to the fact that they need to be involved in plant-based and in meat alternative and in fermentations solution in order to keep their market shares. And we also saw other companies like Nestle, Unilever, and others that don't have the capabilities or the infrastructure to get into the meat industry, that are getting into the meat alternative segment, because there is an opportunity for them to get additional market share. Therefore, we need to see all those players, and we see them already. And I believe that it will be growing up, and like almost every meat manufacturer, the biggest one, definitely having their portfolio a cultured and a plant-based company that they are supporting them and providing good resources in order to grow and to scale in the US and in Europe. And I assume that it will continue, and we need all of them. Basically, we need all of them, and I'm really happy to see that, in the last year, we saw an increase of about $3.1 billion when invested in protein alternative, which is definitely a huge investment, compared to last year. So I believe that it will continue to grow as the time will come.
Right. Now, Will, is your company finding that, the companies that you're working with are getting more acceptance from some governments than others, or are there parts of the world or kinds of consumers who will lean into this kind of technology while others might look to ban it because they don't understand it or they haven't yet regulated to allow for it? How is that playing out across the world?
It's a good question. I would say, I would view it quite positively in that, like in the United States and the EU, there's tremendous desire and demand for these plant-based alternatives. And we're starting to see, these precision fermentation ingredients being put into those plant-based alternatives very successfully. And I already mentioned Impossible Burger, but there's other examples like, Perfect Day, which makes dairy proteins, has a number of different products that are now sold in American stores. And so there's a lot more of these products coming to the market that are being demanded by consumers. So I would say there's been a lot of market pull actually from consumers for these alternatives to traditional animal agriculture. I think that in terms of the cultured meat, that's where we're longer term from a consumer acceptance. But the reality is with cultured meat, we're also 5 to 10 years away from a technical perspective as well. So I think those questions will be, worked on by the industry in the next 5 to 10 years to think about how do we think about regulatory and cultural acceptance. But they aren't issues we need to solve today. And I think the reality of today is we see lots of consumer demand for these plant-based alternatives that are using precision fermentation produced products.
Now, you say 5 to 10 years from a technical perspective. What kind of timeline are we looking at for creating actual products that will meaningfully displace those that are already on the market? Is that 5 to 10 years, or does that take a little bit longer before really beef is swapped out and these are swapped in?
So again, with precision fermentation, making ingredients that are going into plant-based meats, that's happening now. That's very real. We can scale up that type of technology. With cultured meat, it's hard to say because there's so many technical barriers that are so profound and large that it's really difficult to say exactly how long it's going to take. So that's why I say 5 to 10 years, but I really don't know. And I don't think anyone in the industry truly knows and can make a prediction. There's much more fundamental hard technology problems to solve. They're all solvable, right? It's all hard engineering. It's things that we can do. It's all these smart people are working on it. But it's not like there's not a clear path between now and having large scale cultured meat adoption from a technical perspective. This is my view as an engineer and someone who builds the bioreactor infrastructure, which would be used to produce the cultured meat. But I'm not. That's just my perspective, at least.
Yeah, well, you're right. I mean, it's totally unfair to ask about a timeline, but I'm going to do it anyway. Jim, what kind of timeline are you looking at when you're predicting, these products meaningfully displacing those on the market? How is your fund thinking about it?
Well, okay, so I think that the dairy industry is going to be the first major industry to be totally displaced by precision fermentation in particular. Already, a big share of the dairy industry in America and in the UK, as examples, has been displaced by plant-based alternative milks, which are not necessarily better for your health or for the environment for that matter, but they have taken a big share, upwards of a quarter of the share of the UK market. And but the precision fermentation basically creates a replica of whey and casein that means it's almost indistinguishable from milk that comes out of cows. So that's a $750 billion industry around the world. I think in 10 years' time, there'll be no large herds that will be milked. I think that's gone. It's a precarious industry anyway. It's a very cruel industry, and it is the most emitting of all farming activities on the planet. The second area is materials, and collagen and so forth have been mentioned. That's one aspect of it, but you've got things like leather, which is already being produced and sold to the largest fashion houses in labs, where there's no regulatory hurdle, no consumer acceptance hurdle. In fact, it's consumer positive acceptance, I would say. And that's a big market as well. Then you've got fish, which is about a $300 billion industry, and your own American San Diego-based Blue Nalu will be on the market, I think, by the end of next year with its first tuna fish product, which is wholly made in laboratory conditions. And then the last and biggest prize is meat, which is a $1.5 trillion industry, about the size of the Spanish economy. And I think I'm going to go with a bit more optimism on this. I mean, one of our UK companies is forecasting to make 12,500 tons of meat in 4 years' time. It's a spin out of University of Oxford. They've got all the engineering right. I mean, I think it's just incredible. And they'll be making pork meat. But you've got companies like Upside Foods in the United States, formerly known as Memphis. You've got Meatable, Mosa, and a variety of other companies, particularly Israeli companies in chicken. Super Meat is the one that we've got a big investment in. And the chicken nuggets are already on sale in Israel, and they're already on sale in Singapore. So I think it's going to be quicker than people think. And the reason I called my book Moore's Law is that the trajectory of this is faster than the original Moore's Law, from which it's a direct riff. So I'm highly optimistic that by 2030, we'll have a reasonable size share in cultured meat and a larger size share in plant-based meat, but it's going to require a vast amount of money. The sort of $1 billion that Rachel was talking about, 1.2 billion, will be dwarfed by the $1.8 trillion that will be required in the next 10 years in capital expenditure for the plant-based and cultured-based foods. It's a big investment opportunity, but it's also a dauntingly large amount of money.
Right. Well, but at the same time, I mean, there are proven ways to sustainably feed the world they're much simpler, legumes or root vegetables. Why are these high-tech solutions better? Are they both important? I'm very interested in that idea, and I think that's some of the criticism that, comes up from this industry. Rachel, will you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So I think that it's a question about the consumers, the end consumers. When we are trying to convert carnivores, people that are too used to eat meat, and this is their main protein in their plant during the day, in order for us to convince them, the first step is to create something that will give them the same taste, texture, flavor, something that is very close to the real thing, in order to give them the reasonable thinking about moving from meat consumption into plant-based. I do believe that in the future, or in a cultured meat, whatever, I do believe that in the future, and even today, we are starting to see that people will be moving into the plant based solution, which are not basically mimicking meat or pork or seafood, but rather have a very delicious taste that are coming from plant-based. And I think that one of the major movements, other than the climate change and the animal welfare, one of the major reasons why people are moving from those vegetarian group are moving from meat into plant-based are due to health reasons, like they want to consume much less cholesterols and carbohydrates and others. So I think that it's also going to be one of the things that we're going to see in the future. It's coming, like different kind of products that are not just mimicking meat, but are just tasty to us, and we really enjoy eating them, and they are also healthy and good for us. And this is definitely what SavorEat is doing. What we are doing, we are not just creating food product, we are not just creating meat alternative solutions, but we're rather selling a kind of a very unique experience, like bringing the consumer the ability to change its compositions, the level of protein that they wish to get, the level of fat, and trying to tailor the product based on the consumer's needs. And we are truly a believer that this is going to be one of the major change that we were going to see in the next revolution after the plant-based industry.
Thank you. Well, we only have 30 seconds left, so I'm just going to go down the line. What's the biggest challenge that in 25 years we were going to wish we were talking about right now in this space? Jim?
I think in 25 years' time, the whole world will be revolutionize in terms of food. I think we're on the cusp of the third agricultural revolution. It's going to be absolutely tremendous. Huge profits will be made. It will be one of the most significant industries of the future. We're in the dial-up phase of the internet at the moment of it, but it's absolutely necessary. We can't go on having intensive farming the way we currently have it. Otherwise, the planet is going to collapse. So let's hope that this is a big success.
Great. Well, I see our time has run out, so let's go ahead and end it there. Thank you so much to my three panelists today, and thank you all for joining us today.